The Civil War Battle Series, The Regiments of Little Roundtop. Renowned for their valorous stand at Gettysburg, the Little Roundtop Regiment saw many more days of combat, glory, and horror before the Civil War ended. Gazing out through the trees and smoke, the Union officer knew that his weary fighters were in trouble and that the next Confederate attack would likely overwhelm his outnumbered command. What to do? He could not stay put. Retreat was unthinkable. A desperate charge seemed the only choice. Quickly, word was passed down the line. Fix bayonets and attack on command. A final glance told him all was ready. With a great roar, the men rose and charged the enemy. Startled, the onrushing Confederates fired a scathing volley and broke. Those who fought back were either killed or captured. The daring attack by the soldiers of the 20th Maine Infantry Regiment was a stunning success. Was it Colonel Joshua Chamberlain defending Little Roundtop at Gettysburg? No, it was Lieutenant Holloman Melcher leading a charge by Company F of the 20th Maine during the confused fighting in the wilderness on May 5, 1864. Just one example of the heroism that the saviors of Little Roundtop repeatedly displayed long after the smoke had cleared from the battlefield of Gettysburg. 5 regiments did the hard fighting that saved Little Roundtop for the Union: the 20th Maine, 83rd Pennsylvania, 44th New York, 16th Michigan, and the 140th New York. The first 4 made up Colonel Strong Vincent's brigade in the 5th Corps, 1st Division. The final unit was from Brigadier General Stephen Weed's brigade in the 5th Corps, 2nd Division, which arrived in the nick of time to help in the Round Top fight due to the initiative of its commander, Colonel Patrick O'Rourke, and the Army's chief engineer, Brigadier General Gouverneur Warren. Collectively, the units came to be called the Little Roundtop Regiments. The critical role the regiments played at Gettysburg has garnered them much attention, but the story of the Little Roundtop Regiments does not end there. The same men fought in all the major battles leading up to General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April 9, 1865. 4 of the 5 units made it to Appomattox under their original regimental designations. Re-enlisting veterans from the 5th Unit, the 44th New York, were assimilated into the 140th and the 146th New York and marched into Appomattox under the flags of those regiments. The Little Roundtop regiments brought their own unique identities to Gettysburg. 3 of the 5, the 83rd Pennsylvania, 44th New York, and 16th Michigan, had been formed in September of 1861, and they participated in all subsequent major battles of the Eastern Theater. A well-drilled unit, the men of the 83rd Pennsylvania wore special French uniforms, awarded them by Major General Fitzjohn Porter in recognition of their marching precision. The 44th New York members were called Ellsworth's Avengers in honor of Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, who was killed hauling down the rebel flag in Alexandria, Virginia, earlier in the war. Every ward in New York contributed men to this regiment. Recruits had to be at least 5 feet 8 inches tall, single, and under 30, of good moral character. The New Yorkers developed a strong bond with the 83rd Pennsylvania after the Keystone troops shared dinner with the Avengers, who arrived in camp after a long march without provisions. They became known as the Butterfield Twins after their brigade commander, Brigadier General Dan Butterfield. The final veteran Little Roundtop Regiment was the 16th Michigan. Recruited from the Detroit area, the hard-fighting unit had just 263 soldiers by the time it climbed Little Roundtop. By contrast, the 20th Maine and the 140th New York were relatively green outfits. The 140th New York, nicknamed the Rochester Racehorses, suffered its first battle casualties at Chancellorsville, 2 dead and 6 wounded. Quarantined behind the lines with a smallpox epidemic, the 20th Maine missed the battle entirely. The regiment had seen action at Fredericksburg and against some of Lee's rear guard covering the Confederate retreat from Antietam. July 2, 1863, found the troops in the crosshairs of history at Gettysburg. Although Lee had given the new Union commander, Major General George Meade, a bloody nose the previous day, Meade had managed to concentrate his army along the hills and ridges south of the town. Meade's position looked formidable until an unauthorized advance by Major General Dan Sickles' 3rd Corps unhinged Meade's left flank. Southern Lieutenant General James Longstreet eventually launched an attack against Sickles' exposed troops. In response to this crisis, Meade sent the 5th Corps and elements of the 2nd and 12th Corps to Sickles' assistance. Despite the flow of Union reinforcements to Meade's left, the flank's anchor, Little Roundtop, remained devoid of Federal troops when Brigadier General Evander Law's Alabama veterans began moving toward the hill. If Law's men secured Little Roundtop, the hill's cleared summit would provide a natural artillery platform, enfilading the entire Union line. A devastating Federal defeat seemed merely minutes away. Unfortunately for Law and the Southern cause, Gouverneur Warren also saw the problem and managed to intercept Vincent's 1,300-man, 4-regiment 5th Corps Brigade as it marched to aid Sickles and rerouted to Little Roundtop. These bluecoats arrived on the boulder-colored hill scant minutes before 2,400 hard-charging Southerners arrived. The initial Confederate assaults hit the Butterfield twins in the center of Vincent's line, but were easily repelled. The 4th Alabama was particularly shot up as it came under crossfire from the 83rd Pennsylvania and the 20th Maine. Colonel William Oates brought his 15th Alabama and 47th Alabama down the slopes of Big Round Top and attacked Colonel Joshua Chamberlain's 20th Maine. Oates was initially repulsed, but then the tenacious colonel sent out a squad to outflank the Maine men. Ordering a difficult, rarely tried maneuver, Chamberlain successfully stretched his line, bending it back at right angles and frustrating Oates' flanking attempt. Nearly out of ammunition, Chamberlain called for a bayonet attack. His men yelled as they charged down the hill and swept the surprised Confederates from the field. Chamberlain's bold leadership had secured the brigade's left. Vincent's right was a different story. Reinforced by the 48th Alabama, the 4th and 5th Texas renewed their attacks, concentrating on Vincent's right flank regiment, the 16th Michigan. Climbing shelves and crevices to screen their advance up the rocky hill, a few of the Confederates were able to slide by their foes. Soon, the Michigan men began receiving flank fire. As casualties mounted, panic grew. Rebel pressure intensified until suddenly half the Michigan regiment broke in disorder and toward the rear. Vincent climbed a rock to rally the men, but toppled off, mortally wounded. The Michigan men held, but the Texans kept pressing on toward the summit. At the very moment the Southerners believed they had triumphed, Colonel Patrick O'Rourke's 140th New York surged over the crest, racing toward the Confederate ranks. Commandeered by the frantic Warren, O'Rourke's men scrambled up the hill on Vincent's right. As the Rochester racehorses cleared the summit, O'Rourke shouted, "Down this way, boys!" A Confederate salvo killed O'Rourke, but could not stop the charge of his 450 men. The rebels pulled back to Big Round Top and settled down to a long-range firefight. There would be no more attacks on Little Round Top. Whatever gains Lee made on July 1st and 2nd were more than offset by the costly failure of Pickett's charge on July 3rd. The South's second major offensive north of the Potomac River had failed. Meade did not follow up his victory over Lee to President Lincoln's complete satisfaction, and he was superseded by Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant in 1864. Although Meade retained nominal command of the Army of the Potomac, Grant, as General-in-Chief, traveled with the Army and directed its operations. The Little Roundtop Regiments would play a major role in Grant's furious final campaign. Grant opened his advance by crossing the Rapidan River on May 4, 1864. The next day, Union pickets discovered Confederates moving down the Orange Turnpike to threaten the Federal march through a heavily wooded area known as the Wilderness. Grant thought the force was a decoy and ordered the 5th Corps, now commanded by Warren, to punish the intruders. In fact, most of Lieutenant General Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps stood in the Federals' path. The 140th New York, freshly clad in new Zouave uniforms, awarded them as recognition of superior service, headed across Saunders Field just to the right of the Orange Turnpike. Puffs of smoke from Southern muskets started to dot the woodline, and bodies in Zouave uniforms began to litter the ground. But the Rochester racehorses had their blood up. Led by the hat-waving Colonel George Ryan, they sprinted across the field toward the fire-spitting tree line ahead. Crashing into the Confederates, the 140th drove the enemy back through the dense woody tangle in a fierce hand-to-hand struggle. As his troops moved deeper into the smoke-filled woods, Ryan, sensing gunfire to his flank and rear, sent out scouts who reported that the Confederates had overlapped his line. Even worse, the rebels were moving in behind him. Aware that he was being cut off, Ryan immediately ordered a retreat. The Rochester racehorses somehow disengaged and returned to the main Union line, losing 240 casualties in the brief but deadly excursion up and down Saunders Field. Simultaneously with Ryan's advance, Vincent's old brigade, now commanded by Brigadier General Joseph Bartlett, moved forward to the left of the Orange Turnpike. After some initial success, Bartlett began taking heavy flank fire, and the Confederates overlapped his line as well. Casualties quickly mounted, including Colonel Orpheus Woodward, commanding the 83rd Pennsylvania, who took a bullet in the knee, which later required amputation. Sizing up the situation, Bartlett ordered an about-face, and the brigade fought its way back to the Federal lines. All, that is, except for Company F of the 20th Maine. At the end of the regimental front, screened by the woods, they did not hear the command to retire. Lieutenant Melcher learned of his predicament when he noticed Confederate soldiers crossing his rear. Figuring that the regiment had pulled back without him, Melcher realized he was surrounded. As soon as the rebels knew he was there, his little band would be rounded up for a trip to Libby Prison. Desperate, Melcher told his 17 men that they were going to have to cut their way out. The men were to load rifles, fix bayonets, and charge on signal. All were to pick a target and yell, "Surrender!" at the top of their lungs. Screaming men suddenly charging out of thick, smoky woods startled the Confederates, whose ragged volley killed 2 of Melcher's men and wounded a few others. Federal return fire dropped many more rebels, as the rest scattered or surrendered. Company F returned to its lines with 32 prisoners. Grant suffered a tactical defeat in the Wilderness, losing 18,000 men against only 11,000 Confederates. But unlike the Union defeat at Chancellorsville the previous year, Grant won the strategic victory. The Army of the Potomac maintained control of the Brock Road, giving the Federals a short 8-mile march to Spotsylvania Courthouse, the exit from the Wilderness. By contrast, Lee would have to march 13 miles over worse roads to reach that point. Spotsylvania was also astride the route to Richmond. Federal possession of that key hamlet would force Lee to fight Grant out in the open or risk being cut off from Richmond. Realizing this, Grant ordered Warren's 5th Corps to march there just after dark on May 7th. Unknown to Grant, Lee had also ordered his First Corps, now commanded by Major General Richard Anderson, in place of Longstreet, who was wounded on May 6, to undertake a similar nocturnal movement. Aided by Major General Jeb Stuart's delaying cavalry action against Warren, Anderson reached Spotsylvania the next morning, just ahead of the Federals. Anderson took up a strong defensive position across the Brock Road at Laurel Hill. Convinced that he still faced only cavalry and frustrated by the slow pace of the all-night march, Warren ordered his tired troops forward without the benefit of reconnaissance or artillery support. "Never mind cannon, never mind bullets, press on and clear this road," shouted Warren. Taking picket and artillery fire the entire way, the 5th Corps charged up the hill in ragged formation, each regiment moving into line as it came upon the Brock Road. Anderson's men paused a few moments before unleashing solid infantry volleys, stunning the Federals. The attack quickly broke down. The Butterfield twins, the 44th New York and 83rd Pennsylvania, made two of the more successful Union assaults. The New Yorkers halted 20 yards from the Confederate line, firing a series of volleys. Troops from the adjoining 83rd Pennsylvania penetrated the Confederate position and began fighting hand to hand. Amid swinging muskets and screaming men, the 83rd's color-bearer, Corporal M.L. Voges, planted the regimental flag on the enemy's breastworks. But the collapse of the Union left flank regiments doomed the twins by opening their own flank to a devastating counterattack. Hit by enemy fire from two directions, the twin regiments realized that they had to retreat. As he turned to move to the rear, Voges was hit in the chest. Still, he managed to keep his hold on the 83rd's colors. As he staggered and fell, he flung the banner to a comrade to prevent its capture. The last unwounded member of the color party ran a few yards with the flag before he too was wounded. Desperate to get the flag to safety, Voges hailed a nearby 44th New York soldier to rescue the colors. Dodging bullets, the New Yorker scooped up the flag and carried it back to the regiment. The heroic Voges would survive his wounds and received a well-deserved promotion to sergeant. Over the next several days, the 5th Corps made a series of attacks against Laurel Hill that accomplished nothing except to lengthen the Union casualty list. One such casualty was James Rice, former commander of the 44th New York. Promoted to brigadier general and given command of a New York brigade in recognition of his services at Gettysburg, he was shot down on May 10th. When told that his wound was mortal, he replied, "Tell the 44th I am done fighting. Turn me over and let me die with my face to the enemy." Locked in place across from Laurel Hill, the 5th Corps missed the horrific carnage resulting from the Union's partial penetration of the Confederate muleshoe salient on May 12th. Lee was pushed to the brink by Grant's attack, but he held on, and the stalemate at Spotsylvania continued. Grant continued sliding left, trying to gain Lee's flank. The Little Roundtop regiments helped lead this effort, crossing the North Anna River at Jericho Ford on May 23rd. A spirited rebel attack routed several Union brigades, getting to within 1,000 yards of Federal pontoon bridges. Preparing to charge some Union artillery batteries, the only organized Federal defense remaining in front of the bridges, the Confederates' right suddenly collapsed when Bartlett mounted a 3-regiment flank attack. The 83rd Pennsylvania led the assault, driving off the 1st South Carolina. During the charge, Pennsylvania Corporal Lewis Corbin collared the South Carolina Brigade commander, Colonel Joseph Brown, yanking him back to the Union lines as a prisoner. With the North Anna fighting proving inconclusive, Grant once again slid left, reaching the vicinity of Cold Harbor on June 1st. Stationed to the right at Bethesda Church, the 5th Corps was fortunate enough to miss Grant's doomed Cold Harbor onslaught 2 days later. The Little Roundtop regiments crossed the James River with the rest of the army in mid-June, participating in subsequent assaults on Petersburg. The Federal soldiers were exhausted and worn from the month of maneuvering in battle, and only minimal gains resulted from these assaults, as Warren, like the other Union Corps commanders, failed to drive his attacks home. Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, former commander of the 20th Maine and now in charge of the 5th Corps Infantry Brigade, fell in action at Petersburg. Chamberlain had received orders to make an unsupported attack on a heavily defended part of the Confederate lines guarding the Jerusalem Plank Road. After lodging a fruitless protest with Meade's headquarters, Chamberlain led his men forward. As the brigade emerged into open ground, it received a sharp volley that struck dozens of troops, including a color-bearer. Chamberlain grasped the flag and carried it toward the enemy lines. 40 yards into the maelstrom, Chamberlain took a bullet through his hips. The doctors pronounced the wound mortal, and it would, in fact, kill him, but not for another 50 years. In the meantime, Chamberlain was promoted to brigadier general, and upon his recovery the following spring, he returned to lead his brigade for the final decisive stage of the campaign. The 9-month siege of Petersburg was made up of several dozen battles and engagements, including a crucial 3-day fight that August for possession of the Weldon Railroad. Known as the Battle of Globe Tavern, the fierce contest exploded when Grant extended his lines west across the railroad. Once again, Warren's 5th Corps drew the tough assignment of spearheading the movement. When the smoke cleared, Warren was firmly astride the railroad, but only after some hard fighting. The initial Union position extended west along a tree line before turning south at the railroad. The Confederate division of Major Generals Henry Heath and William Mahone advanced unseen through the woods, hitting Warren hard. The 140th New York was in danger of being cut off and fought its way to the rear, where the Zouaves reformed under cover of Union artillery. Ordered to make an immediate counterattack, the Zouaves reclaimed their lost ground, rescuing many captured comrades, including their brigade commander. The Confederate attacks battered but did not break the Federal lines. The 5th Corps still maintained its hold on the railroad. Heath and Mahone now shifted their attacks to the southern portion of the Union line, which paralleled the railroad. This time, the rebel reconnaissance was poor, and the Confederates walked right into a trap. As soon as they reached the middle of an open field, their ranks were shredded by a withering crossfire exploding from the Union breastworks. For the 20th Maine, it was payback time. One soldier wrote, "Our men enjoyed it very much, for we remembered how often we had been obliged to charge upon their lines and be shot down by the thousands while they were screened from our fire, and we now rejoiced that for once the tables were turned." Having lost the Weldon Railroad, Petersburg's last remaining lifeline was the South Side Railroad. Grant would continue his leftward slide until that too fell under his control, dooming Petersburg and the Confederacy to their inevitable surrender. One of the stepping stones to cutting the South Side Railroad was a battle called Peebles Farm. The Union 5th Corps again led the flanking push. Grant believed that Lee's fortifications on the Confederates' extreme right were incomplete and poorly manned. He was wrong. On September 30th, 1864, the 5th Corps came upon a line of Confederate breastworks supported by an artillery redoubt. The 16th Michigan, 83rd Pennsylvania, and the 32nd Massachusetts were told to capture the position. Unlike their fellow Round Top Regiments, the 16th Michigan had been under a cloud since Gettysburg. A portion of the regiment had given way under pressure, nearly losing Little Roundtop. The regiment's commander, Colonel Norvell Welch, was among those who had pulled back during the confusion. Whether he lost his nerve or retreated up the hill in an attempt to rally his men remained a matter of controversy. As Welch prepared his men to charge the Peebles Farm redoubt, he knew this would be his last battle. His enlistment had expired, and no further fighting was required of him. Nonetheless, he decided to remain with his troops while awaiting his formal discharge. Perhaps he was looking for one final opportunity to erase the stigma of Gettysburg. At last, the order to advance was given, and the Union lines stepped forward. With Confederate artillery ripping holes in his lines, Welch led his men up the walls of the rebel fort. "A commission to him who first mounts the parapet of the redoubt," called out Welch. "Follow me!" Sword in hand, Welch sprinted ahead of his men and leaped onto the walls of the redoubt. He climbed a few steps and then toppled backward with a bullet through his head. Eager to avenge the colonel's death, the Michigan men stormed over the fort's walls, capturing 100 prisoners and a rebel cannon. They spotted a second line of entrenchments and charged out, helping capture those works as well. At the end of the day, Grant finally had a position from which he had hoped he could launch an assault on the South Side Railroad. At the cost of his life, Colonel Welch had forever redeemed his honor. Despite the best efforts of the Army of the Potomac, however, Lee managed to prevent the capture of Petersburg throughout the winter of 1864-65. In the spring of 1865, Grant devised a new plan to break the Petersburg deadlock. He ordered Warren's Fifth Corps to move around the end of the Confederate lines, isolating Major General George Pickett's 10,000-man outpost from Lee's main army 3 miles away. Meanwhile, Grant directed Major General Philip Sheridan to sweep up the back roads with his cavalry and either cut the South Side Railroad or pounce on Pickett if he attempted to interfere. Pickett's job was to act as a mobile, detached force capable of blocking any Federal attempt on the railroad. Unknown to Pickett, he had been cut off from Lee as a result of Warren's victories at Lewis Farm and White Oak Road on March 29th and 31st. Chamberlain, recovered from his Petersburg wound and now in command of a brigade in Brigadier General Charles Griffin's 5th Corps Division, played a decisive role in both battles. Chamberlain's brigade led the way at Lewis Farm, repulsing a vigorous Confederate counterattack. At White Oak Road, a determined rebel attack routed 2 Union divisions before Warren personally ordered Chamberlain to rectify the situation. Chamberlain's counterattack repulsed the Confederates, gaining a lodgment across White Oak Road. Meanwhile, Pickett won a small victory over Sheridan's troopers at Dinwiddie Courthouse. Then, under Grant's orders, Warren reached Sheridan on April 1st, allowing Sheridan to launch a combined cavalry and infantry assault on Pickett's troops at 5 Forks later that day. The attack totally smashed Pickett's force. The way to the South Side Railroad was open. The war-torn Fifth Corps fought well in the battle subsequently referred to as the Waterloo of the Civil War. 2 men from the Little Roundtop Regiments, Sergeant Robert Shipley of the 140th New York and Lieutenant Albert Furtnauld of the 20th Maine, received the Medal of Honor for capturing the 9th Virginia colors during a wild melee in the center of the rebel line. The commanding general also had praise for Chamberlain, who he had saw leading his men into the attack. Galloping over, Sheridan shouted, "By God, that's what I want to see! General officers at the front!" Warren, though, was a different matter. Angered over Warren's apparent slowness, Sheridan summarily sacked him, appointing Griffin to replace him as the 5th Corps commander. The day after Pickett's defeat at 5 Forks, Lee abandoned his Petersburg lines and marched west, hoping to reach the rail lines that could take him to General Joseph Johnston's troops in North Carolina. Grant had other ideas, and 8 days later, on Palm Sunday, the more numerous, better supplied Army of the Potomac brought Lee to bay at Appomattox Courthouse. Out of options and surrounded on 3 sides, Lee reluctantly agreed to surrender his army. With the war drawing to a close, the Little Roundtop regiments were given one final task. The evening of the day that Lee signed the surrender papers, Griffin informed Chamberlain that he would have the honor of receiving the surrender of weapons and flags from Lee's entire army on April 12th. He felt that the honor should go to one of the heroes of Gettysburg. Joshua Chamberlain was one among many candidates for the task. A major factor in this favor was that he was still alive and in the army. A quick roll call of the Little Roundtop commanders is instructive. Colonel O'Rourke of the 140th New York, along with Brigade Commander Colonel Vincent, were killed during the famous engagement. The 83rd Pennsylvania commanding officer Colonel Woodward lost a leg at the Wilderness, knocking him out of the war. Colonel, later General Rice of the 44th New York, died facing the enemy at Spotsylvania, and Colonel Welch of the 16th Michigan fell charging a redoubt at Peebles Farm. Many of the heroes were gone. Chamberlain seemed to recognize the sacrifices of these other soldiers. Although his new command had fought well, it was a relatively recent addition to the Army of the Potomac. Chamberlain asked if he could be reunited with his old comrades, the 1st Division, 3rd Brigade, for this one day. This was to be a crowning incident of history, and I thought these veterans deserved the recognition, Chamberlain later wrote. His request was approved. For a single day, Chamberlain was back among the soldiers of the 20th Maine, 83rd Pennsylvania, and 16th Michigan. Chamberlain looked up old friends and prepared his former comrades for one last gesture of chivalry. On the morning of the appointed day, Major General John Gordon led his first group of Confederates up the Surrender Triangle to lay down their arms and battle flags. Dejected, heads hanging low, Gordon and his men marched slowly forward. As they rounded the final turn, overcome by emotion and memories, oblivious to their surroundings, the sudden bark of a bugle pierced the air. Instantly, the Federal troops lining the road snapped to carry arms. Gordon wrenched through his thoughts as he recognized the significance of Chamberlain's salute, wheeled his horse, and then gracefully brought his sword point down to his boot toe. Gordon then ordered his own men to carry arms, two honorable gestures signifying the respect those fellow Americans felt for each other. So ended the last page in the heroic story of the Little Roundtop Regiments. The men went back to their wives and sweethearts, their farms and their fishing boats. They had been involved in a great enterprise and had succeeded. Many had died before the goal had been achieved, but in a way, they had succeeded also. The Union was preserved at a cost that the survivors of the Little Roundtop Regiments knew all too well.